She called him weak until his blade began to sing. The alarm was already screaming when I buckled my belt. Not a drill. I had learned to tell the difference in the first week aboard the Vale warship Dominion's Reach. Drills had a rhythm, a pause between tones, a kind of polite urgency. This was raw and sharp and constant, the kind of sound that shoved your pulse upward before your brain even processed why. It filled the corridor outside my quarters and bounced off the curved metal walls and sat in my chest like a fist. I grabbed my kit with one hand and my blade with the other. The blade was the first thing anyone noticed about me. It had been the first thing from the very beginning, the first morning I set foot on this ship. 412 millimeters of carbon steel, hand-forged, edge-ground on a stone wheel by a man who had never once touched a plasma cutter in his life. My grandfather made it in a small shed behind his house in a town in Yorkshire, England, on a planet called Earth, which was 420 light-years from where I was currently standing. He pressed it into my hands the morning I shipped out, and he did not make a speech about it. He said, "It never needs charging, lad. That is its whole virtue." I had laughed. He had not. His eyes had been steady and entirely serious, the way old eyes get when they have seen enough of the world to know the difference between what is genuinely important and what only feels important in the moment. I was the only human on the ship. Sergeant Cale Morrow, 31 years old, former ground infantry, 2 campaigns, 4 commendations, 1 injury to the left knee that had mostly healed but could predict cold weather more accurately than the ship's atmospheric sensors. Currently classified as diplomatic attachment to the 6th Strike Unit of the Vale Dominion. That title was a careful and polite way of saying I was a political decoration. The Dominion had signed an exchange treaty with the Earth Coalition the previous year, and the terms of that treaty required a human presence on a Vale warship. The presence they selected was mine. I had been chosen based on my service record, my physical conditioning, and the fact that I spoke standard galactic well enough to be clearly understood, which was a more uncommon quality among Earth infantry than the treaty negotiators had expected. The Vale were extraordinary. There was no other accurate word for it, and I had stopped pretending to be neutral about it after the 3rd day of the assignment. They stood roughly 2 meters tall on average. Their hands had 4 fingers each and were built for precision in a way that looked almost wrong until you watched them work, and then it looked completely inevitable. Their legs could push them into a sprint that would have left any human athlete behind in the first few seconds. Their reflexes ran at approximately twice the speed of a human at peak physical condition. Their bones were denser, their wounds closed faster, their eyes could function in conditions that would leave a human standing in complete blindness. They had plasma rifles that could carve through reinforced hull plating. They had powered exo-armor that turned a single soldier into something resembling a mobile fortification. They had been fighting wars across the outer reach for 600 years, with the systematic, dedicated professionalism of a species that had decided long ago that the galaxy was worth competing for. They were very good at what they did, and they thought I was somewhere between a novelty and a liability. Commander Sareth Van made her assessment of me clear within the first hour. She was the unit's commanding officer, tall even by Vale standards, with a face that had been through enough campaign seasons to lose any remaining interest in comfort or performance. She had 12 ribbons on her chest plate, each one marking a different theater of operation across the outer reach. She had never lost a unit in combat. She intended that record to remain exactly as it was. The first morning of my assignment, she was running a briefing in the forward corridor when I arrived. The unit stood in 2 lines, armor polished, plasma rifles racked along the wall behind them. She stopped speaking when I walked in and looked at me with the steady, flat attention of someone performing an equipment assessment and arriving at a disappointing conclusion. Then her gaze found the blade at my hip. It stayed there for a moment. Then she looked at her unit and then back at the blade, and she said, "Does the soft creature plan to cut his food with that?" They laughed, all 8 of them, immediately and without reservation, that easy and collective laugh that happens when a group of people is entirely certain they are not the subject of the joke. Private Yethsal, the youngest of the unit, barely passed his first campaign posting, laughed the loudest. He had a young soldier's habit of calibrating his reactions to match his commander's signals. I looked at the blade. I looked at Sareth Van. I held her gaze. "It does what it needs to do," I said. She turned back to her briefing without another word. That was the end of our first conversation. The days that followed were not cruel. The Veil were not spiteful people, and I want to be precise about that, because it matters to the shape of what came later. They were simply indifferent in the specific way that soldiers are indifferent to anything they have been told is not their operational concern. I was not their operational concern. I had been added to their unit by treaty obligation, not by military need, and everyone in that unit knew it, including me. They briefed together, trained together, ate together. I was included in briefings because protocol required it. I trained in the unit's gym because there was no other facility available to me, and I ran my own routines in the early morning hours before the Veil arrived, so as not to be in anyone's way. I ate at the edge of the common area and watched how they interacted, because watching how people interact when they are relaxed tells you considerably more about them than watching how they perform under pressure. Yethsal sat across from me at the third evening meal without announcement or explanation. He simply arrived with his tray and set it down and began eating. He did not speak. I did not speak. We ate in silence, and then he took his tray and went back to the others. The following evening he sat across from me again. This continued. It became a pattern, a small one, unremarked by anyone but consistent. Yethsal was a collector of information, I had begun to realize. He stored observations the way other soldiers stored ammunition, quietly and carefully, against the day when they might be useful. I cleaned the blade every evening without fail. Edge first, following the bevel, then the flat on both sides, then the handle, then back again. It was a habit so deeply established that my hands did it while my thoughts were somewhere else entirely. The blade did not need cleaning that frequently. It had not been used since I arrived. But the act of cleaning it was not purely practical. It was attention. It was the daily acknowledgement that the thing in your hands matters enough to be cared for properly. The Veil noticed. They did not comment, but I began to catch glances from the edge of my vision, unhurried observations that lasted a fraction of a second too long before moving away. You can always tell when a soldier is watching you and pretending not to. Soldiers are trained observers, which means they also know how to recognize observation in others, which creates an interesting situation when two groups of soldiers are quietly monitoring each other across a room. The mission briefing came on the 7th day of my posting. Keth 9 was a dead moon. It orbited a gas giant at the far edge of a contested sector, airless and geologically quiet, its surface broken into irregular plains of cold rock and long, deep fissures that let faint starlight down into what lay beneath the crust. A Dominion archive drone had crashed there 22 days earlier. The drone carried navigational records and intelligence files relevant to 3 ongoing operations, along with what the briefing officer referred to only as sensitive protocol data. The Dominion needed that core retrieved before any rival faction located the crash site. The complication was the hollow. The briefing officer explained the hollow with the careful, measured tone of someone who had delivered this particular information before and knew that the first response was always disbelief. The hollow were not alive. They had been manufactured, centuries ago, by a civilization whose name was now preserved only in academic records and whose physical infrastructure had been entirely gone for 400 years. What remained of their work was the hollow, autonomous war constructs, roughly humanoid in general shape, but with no organic components, no capacity for communication, no hierarchy that could be negotiated with, and no operational directive beyond the elimination of anything that registered as an intruder in their designated territory. Keth-9 had been their designated territory for longer than the Dominion had existed as a political structure. They maintained themselves. They reproduced themselves using raw materials harvested from the moon's surface. They ran on an internal power generation system that the Dominion's engineers had studied for decades without fully understanding, and they emitted a continuous electromagnetic pulse field that disrupted every energy-based system within its range. Every plasma rifle, every powered exo-armor system, every suit display and communicator and navigation tool. The briefing officer noted this with a controlled neutrality that suggested he was aware of exactly how that information sounded and had decided there was no version of it that could be made comfortable. Sareth Van asked about shielded systems. The briefing officer said the shielding had been tested across 3 previous attempts at retrieval. The Hollow's field had overwhelmed every configuration. Nothing powered survived beyond the moon's outer crust. The room was quiet. I sat at the far end of the briefing table and looked at the mission data on the display and thought about my grandfather's shed and the smell of heated metal and the sound the grinding wheel made on a cold morning in Yorkshire. Sareth Van dismissed the briefing and turned to her senior soldiers. She did not ask for my input. I did not offer it. I went back to my quarters, checked the blade's edge, which was exactly as it always was, and sat on the edge of my bunk and looked at my hands and thought carefully about what 40 hollow units in an electromagnetic dead zone meant for a team of soldiers whose entire tactical capability had been built around powered systems. I thought about it for a long time. We departed for Keth-9 in the early hours of the following morning. The transport dropped us at the edge of the moon's gravity envelope, and we came down in a sealed drop pod. 8 Veil soldiers in full exo-armor, plasma rifles charged and ready, helmet displays cycling through approach telemetry, and 1 human in standard military field gear with a blade on his belt and no powered systems to lose. Sareth Van gave me one instruction before the drop hatch sealed. "Stay behind the unit," she said. "Do not engage, do not slow us down." I nodded. The hatch sealed, the pod fell. We hit Keth-9's surface hard, a controlled impact that rattled the teeth and reset the body's sense of where it was. The ramp dropped. Cold, thin air pushed in from outside, carrying the smell of mineral cold and absolute silence. And then the Hollow's field reached us. The exo-armor seized first, all 8 suits simultaneously, the powered joints locking with a series of hard mechanical clicks that echoed through the silence. The plasma rifles lost charge a breath later, indicators dropping to 0 in unison. The helmet displays flickered and went dark. The communicators gave one brief burst of static and then went completely silent. Sareth Van stood completely still in her dead armor. In the thin starlight that came down through a long fissure above us, I watched her take 2 full seconds to process and accept what had happened to her capabilities. 2 seconds was a long time for Sareth Van. She did everything fast and with complete decision. 2 seconds told me how significant the impact was. I had my blade out before she turned. The fissure above us emitted a thin, cold line of starlight. Not much, not enough for most purposes, but enough for mine. "I can see the path," I said. She turned. She looked at me. I could not read her expression clearly in the faint light, but I could hear the pause before she spoke, and that pause contained considerably more than the single word that followed it. "Move," she said. I moved. The Hollow found us 11 minutes into the tunnel system. It came from a side passage without warning, appearing at the edge of the mineral luminescence that ran along the base of the tunnel walls in faint pale strips. It was a tall, angular shape of dark metal with limbs that moved with an efficiency that was deeply unsettling to observe. It did not rush. It moved with the certainty of a thing that had been doing exactly this for a very long time and saw no reason to change its approach. Sareth Van raised her plasma rifle. The indicator was completely dark, nothing happened. I was already stepping forward. The blade came out with that sound. The low, clean ring of steel on leather and then open air, a note that was brief and precise, and in the absolute silence of that tunnel, clear as a struck bell in an empty room. My grandfather said that sound was the blade telling you it was ready. I had always thought that was poetry. Standing in that tunnel, I decided it was something more practical than poetry. The hollow oriented on me. Its sensors swept across my position. It moved. I moved with it. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Close work in the thin mineral light, the blade finding the gaps in the construct's frame where the metal was thinnest, the joint housings and internal connector points where the system sat without the protection that the external plating provided. A plasma burst would have ended this from several meters away in a fraction of a second. The blade required proximity, precision, specific knowledge of where to put an edge to accomplish what needed to be accomplished. But it accomplished it. The hollow stopped moving. I stepped back. I turned. The unit was watching me. 8 Veil soldiers in locked armor, standing in the tunnel, completely still. Yethzal's mouth was slightly open. Sarath Van looked at the construct on the floor. She looked at the blade in my hand. She looked at me. Her expression was doing several things simultaneously and had not finished working through all of them. I waited for her. "Move," she said. I turned back to the tunnel. Behind me, 8 sets of armored boots began to follow. The tunnels of Keth-9 had not been formed by any natural process. Whoever had originally built and deployed the hollow had also carved these passages, long ago, for purposes that the Dominion's historians had catalogued without fully understanding. The walls were smooth and slightly curved, with a quality of deliberate making that was distinct from geological formation. The ceiling varied, generous in some sections and narrow in others, and in the narrowest parts the armored Veil had to angle their shoulders and move carefully, their locked exosuits adding resistance where they used to add power. I navigated by what I had available. Sound was the most reliable instrument. The acoustic quality of an enclosed space changes as it widens or narrows, and your ears register that change before your eyes confirm it. A tunnel opening into a chamber ahead of you has a different quality to its returning echo than a tunnel about to narrow, and the difference is consistent if you trust yourself to hear it. Temperature came second. Air in an enclosed system moves according to its connections to larger spaces, and the skin of your hands and face reads that movement if you pay attention and have not habituated yourself into ignoring it. The mineral luminescence at the base of the walls was inconsistent, stronger in some sections and barely present in others, but even at its dimmest, it provided just enough reference to confirm what sound and temperature were suggesting. It was not comfortable navigation, it was not fast, but it was accurate. Sarath Van walked directly behind me. I could hear her armor moving, the way each step required slightly more deliberate effort than it would have in a powered suit. Veil exo-armor in its active state was designed to amplify natural movement, to add force and range to what the body already did. Without the power systems, it was dense and resistant, a suit that had become an obstacle. She bore it without a sound of complaint. Whatever Sarath Van had learned across 12 campaigns, the management of unwanted conditions was clearly part of it. Yethzal was 3 positions back. Occasionally, when the passage widened enough, he moved slightly to the side to observe my hands, the angle of my grip, the small adjustments of the blade as we moved through different sections of tunnel. He was watching how I navigated with the blade present rather than sheathed. I noticed without showing it. He was learning, not copying, cataloging. The second hollow came from above. A shaft in the ceiling, narrow and dark, almost invisible until the construct was already moving through it. I heard the air pressure in the tunnel change a fraction of a second before it appeared, a subtle compression, the shaft displacing the column of air as something moved rapidly through it. I was already stepping right when the hollow landed. The blade was in position before the construct had fully oriented itself. The exchange was brief but more demanding than the first. This hollow was slightly larger, and its reach was longer, and it was faster in the initial moments than I had anticipated. It scored my shoulder on its second pass, the edge of one articulated limb cutting through my jacket and opening the skin beneath. I felt the cold air on the wound and put it aside. There was a discipline to continuing after the body registers an injury, a particular act of mental organization that separates the awareness of the damage from the attention required to finish the task. You do not pretend the injury is not there. Pretending does not work and eventually produces worse outcomes. You acknowledge it, place it somewhere in the background of your attention, and continue. I continued. The hollow stopped moving. I stepped back. Sarath Van was immediately at my shoulder. How did you know it was coming? Air pressure in the tunnel changed, I said. Something moving through that shaft compressed the column of air. Small change, but consistent. She was quiet for a moment. Our systems cannot detect pressure variance at that level of sensitivity. I know, I said. Your systems detect considerably more than I can across most conditions. That particular thing they don't register. Another moment of quiet. Continue, she said. The pattern of the hollow's patrol routes became clearer the deeper we moved. They swept in overlapping arcs, 2 units working in coordination, covering sections of the tunnel system and returning. The arcs were consistent. Consistent things are predictable, and predictable things can be used. At a junction, I stopped the group and watched for 90 seconds. 2 units, I said. Left passage. They sweep to the far end and return on a fixed interval. The gap between their return pass and the start of the next arc is approximately 40 seconds. Sarath Van moved up beside me. She looked down the dark passage. She could not see what I was describing, but she processed the information with the same sharp precision she would have applied to a tactical display. 40 seconds to cross the passage cleanly, she said. At a steady pace, I said. Not rushing. Rushing creates sound. Go first and confirm the timing, she said. I went. Across the passage, flat against the far wall, blade in hand in case the timing was wrong. The hollow swept back on schedule, past 2 meters from where I stood without registering my presence, and continued to the far end of the passage. I counted the interval. I signaled. The unit crossed in 2 groups, smooth and controlled, each step placed with care. Sarath Van came last. She crossed with the easy, measured precision of someone who had spent decades doing difficult things in unfavorable conditions, and had learned that deliberate movement was more reliable than fast movement. She stopped beside me on the far side. You navigate this way with your senses alone, she said. Yes. Trained. Partly, I said. Some of it trained. Some of it is simply what humans carry from a long time of doing it before we had any other option. She looked at me for a moment, then she looked down the passage ahead. Continue, she said. We went deeper. The hollow became more frequent. Pairs became clusters of 3 and 4. Their patrol density increased, their response faster. We were moving closer to the core of their territory, and the core was always defended more heavily than the perimeter. This was true of every defensive system I had ever studied, mechanical or living. Not every hollow needed to be engaged directly. I began reading the timing well enough to hold the unit still in the shadow of a wall formation and let patrol arcs pass rather than cutting through them. The key was absolute stillness, not the stillness of hiding, the stillness of something that is not moving and therefore does not register as a threat to sensors built to detect movement in active systems. The veil held still with the discipline of trained professionals, but Yethsal held still in a particular way. He had a physical quietness to him that went beyond technique. I noticed it the second time we stopped, the way his entire body settled into the wall with a quality that was almost absent. He had been watching how I did it, and he had translated the watching into something real inside a very short time. I filed that away. Sarath Van held still with absolute control. No adjustment, no shifting of weight, no response to the discomfort of the locked armor beyond what was necessary. Whatever she had built herself into across 12 campaigns, this was part of it. The retrieval chamber came 90 minutes after we entered the tunnel system. It was large, a natural cave that the builders had incorporated into their design, its walls sweeping up into a high dome. The mineral luminescence was stronger here than anywhere else we had passed through, enough that even the veil could see without depending entirely on me. And in the center of the chamber, resting at an angle against a rock formation, was the archive core, a gray-green cylinder with the Dominion seal pressed into its upper face, marked by the crash but sealed and intact. I looked at it for 2 seconds. Then I looked at the 40 hollow units distributed around the chamber's edge. They stood motionless, not in sleep mode, not powered down, simply waiting with the total, biological need-free patience of machines that did not experience the passing of time the way organic things did. 40 constructs, no functional weapons, one passage in and the same passage out. I worked through the available options in my head. I was thorough about it, because the situation required thoroughness, and because I had learned long ago that the time you spend working through a problem carefully before you begin almost always saves time during the problem itself. Sarath Van appeared beside me. She took in the chamber, she took in the core, she took in the 40 hollow units. She was quiet for a moment that lasted longer than most moments do. Options, she said, just the word, released into the space between us, level and direct. But underneath it was something I had not heard from her before. Not quite uncertainty. The specific alertness of a very experienced soldier who has just recognized that the situation requires a kind of answer that her standard tools cannot produce. I told her the plan. I laid it out twice, going slowly enough the second time to make certain each person had the specific elements they needed. The veil absorbed tactical information with speed and precision. They were built for it and trained for it and had been doing it their entire careers. No one asked questions when I finished. The plan was simple. Simple plans do not give unexpected variables more surface area to damage. I would enter the chamber first and create a deliberate draw, pulling the hollow's attention toward the left side of the space and away from the right. The first group of veil, 3 soldiers, would move through the right side under that cover and reach the archive core. The second group, the remaining 5, would hold the exit passage and manage whatever followed me out. When the core was secure, I would disengage and bring the hollow toward the exit, where the passage narrowed them to a single file, where the veil in their locked exo-armor had mass and leverage that did not require powered systems. Sarath Van listened without expression until I finished. Then she ran through it with that careful, experienced mind. Disengaging from that many units while maintaining a controlled draw requires precise timing throughout, she said. If the arc collapses before you reach the exit. I know what happens, I said. She looked at me steadily. Do you? Yes, I said. I have thought through the consequence carefully, and it is still the best option available to us. Another moment of silence. Then she put her gauntleted hand on my arm, just briefly, resting there, the weight of locked armor against my sleeve. No words, no encouragement, no commander's speech for the moment before something difficult. She simply held my gaze with those experienced eyes and nodded once. I turned toward the chamber entrance. I drew the blade. The sound it made rang through the dome before I had taken my first step. That low, clean note, steel on leather and then air, moving through the curved space and returning changed, layered, fuller than a single note had any right to be. It did not announce itself. It simply was present in the air, occupying the chamber with the same quiet and complete fact, as the mineral light in the walls. The nearest hollow turned first, then the ones behind them, a slow wave of mechanical attention sweeping toward me from around the chamber's edge. I walked in. The first 4 came together from the left side. I moved to meet them, drawing them further left, keeping the right side of the chamber open. I worked through them in sequence, the blade moving with the rhythm that had been building across the whole of the night, no excess, no wasted reach, each movement going exactly where it needed to go and stopping there. The hollow were consistent. They responded to what they detected and pursued what they had identified as a threat. I was the identified threat. I was moving in the direction I needed them to move. My shoulder was tight. I put it in its box and kept working. More hollow converged from the center and right of the chamber. I widened my arc, maintaining the draw, keeping the right side accessible for the veil group moving toward the core. Somewhere across the space, I heard the careful, deliberate movement of soldiers doing exactly what they had been told to do. The sound of the blade changed. I noticed it in the middle of the 6th or 7th exchange. The note it produced had deepened, filled out, taken on a quality that was richer than what it had been at the start of the night. My grandfather had explained this once. Steel changes its voice when it warms, he said. The metal that has been working speaks differently than the metal at rest. The molecular state of the material shifts with heat and stress, and the acoustic properties shift with it. The sound moves through a warm blade, the way sound moves through something that is fully itself, rather than waiting to become so. The blade was singing. That is the only word I have for what it was doing by the time I was deep into the chamber, with the hollow converging from multiple directions and my body running at the edge of its reserves. The sound it made on each movement was a sustained, complex note that found the dome's curved ceiling and came back layered, changed, richer than what had gone up. It filled the space without force. From across the chamber, Yethsal heard it. He told me this afterward. In the middle of everything, through all the noise of the situation, he heard the blade singing, and it was the most unexpected and significant thing he had encountered in a long career of encountering significant things. The signal came from the exit passage, a sharp, deliberate pattern of strikes against the tunnel wall. The core was secure. The first group was clear. I began to disengage. This part required more discipline than anything that had come before it in that chamber. Withdrawing while maintaining the draw, keeping the hollow following me toward the exit rather than dispersing through the space, moving backward through an environment I could not fully see, while things were happening behind me that I could not monitor. All of it simultaneously. All of it without anything except attention, trained instinct, and the body's ability to do what it has rehearsed, until rehearsal becomes something closer to knowledge than memory. I moved in a long arc toward the exit passage rather than a straight line. Straight lines are predictable, and predictable creates problems when the thing pursuing you has no preference for elegance. The arc gave me time and angle. The hollow followed with the perfect, inexorable consistency of machines that had been built with one purpose, and had been executing that purpose without interruption for 4 centuries. They followed me into the passage. The veil were there, 2 soldiers on each side of the entrance, positioned with the settled readiness of people who had been told what was coming and had decided to be completely ready for it. The passage was narrow enough that only one hollow could come through at a time. The first came through and met 2 veil soldiers who had no functional weapons but had the combined mass of 2 beings in dense exo-armor. Leverage that comes from 600 years of martial discipline encoded in muscle memory, and the specific and sustained focus of professionals who understand exactly what is at stake. The construct was stopped. The second came through, the third, each one met the same outcome. It was hard work. The kind of hard work where the difficulty is not any single moment but the sustained accumulation of moments, each one demanding something, the cost building over time in a way that numbers do not capture. The veil were breathing heavily before it was finished. Veil soldiers do not tire easily. The fact that they were audibly breathing said something real about what the passage had required of them. The hollow stopped coming. The chamber went quiet. I stood at the far end of the passage and checked the unit. 8 soldiers, every one of them present and standing. The archive core was in the first group's possession, casing marked by the crash and the night's work, interior sealed and recoverable. I turned the blade once in my hand. Then I returned it to the sheath. The sound it made as it settled was low and complete, the sound of a thing that has done what it was made to do. Sareth Van walked over. She stopped in front of me and looked at my shoulder, where the wound from the earlier exchange had opened further during the work in the chamber. My jacket was dark with it. "You are injured," she said. "I know. You continued after that happened." "Yes." She held my gaze directly. "Why?" I thought about how to answer this honestly. "Because we were not done," I said. "There was more to do. Stopping before a thing is finished is not something I know how to do when the situation still needs me." She was quiet for a moment. The unit was moving around us, preparing for extraction, the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers settling back into their familiar rhythms now that the immediate situation had resolved. "In my experience," Sareth Van said carefully, "there is a type of soldier who continues under injury because they cannot accurately assess their own risk. They do not stop because they lack the judgment to know when stopping is correct." "Yes," I said. "And then there is a different type," she said, "who continues because they have assessed the situation, understood the consequence of stopping, and determined that completion requires them to keep going regardless." I waited. "You are the second type," she said. Not a question, a statement of a conclusion reached. I nodded. She turned and issued extraction commands to the unit, and the team moved. The transport collected us 43 minutes after we signaled from the surface. The pod was cramped and cold and smelled of metal, and the particular exhaustion that settles into a group of soldiers after extended close work in a difficult environment. Nobody spoke much during the ascent. The Veil processed experience, the way people do who have been through enough of it to know that the body needs time before the mind can fully account for what has happened. I sat with my kit in my lap and the blade across my knees. My shoulder had been dressed by one of the Veil medics with the field supplies in my own kit, efficiently and without conversation, which I appreciated. The wound was clean and would close properly. It would leave a mark. Most things that matter leave marks. Yethsal sat across from me. He had been looking at the blade since we boarded. After a while he said, "Sergeant Morrow, in the chamber, when the blade was working." I looked at him. "I heard it change," he said. "From across the space, in the middle of everything that was happening, I heard it become something different than it had been in the tunnels." "Yes," I said. "Why did it change?" I thought about how to explain this to someone who had grown up in a culture where steel blades were historical artifacts, where combat tools were measured in energy yield and plasma output. "Steel changes when it warms," I said. "The blade was working all night. The metal heats with use, and its acoustic properties change with the temperature. The sound that moves through warm steel is richer than the sound through cold steel." Yethsal sat with this. "Your grandfather knew this." "He knew it the way you know something when you have worked with it every day for your entire life," I said. "He made blades. He maintained them. He understood them through his hands." "Do you make them as well?" "No," I said. "That particular ability was not given to me. But I was given the education to respect what someone else made well, and to care for it properly, and to use it correctly, which is its own kind of understanding." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Sergeant Morrow, after we return to the ship, would you teach me?" I looked at him. "Not the blade." He added immediately, "I am not asking to use your blade. I am asking about the way of navigating without instruments, the way of reading what is in the air and the sound of a space and the pressure of a closed environment. I watched you all night. I want to understand it more fully. It is not one skill, I said. It is many things together. Attention is the foundation. Patience is what attention rests on. And underneath both of them is the willingness to trust what your body tells you when your instruments are telling you nothing. The hesitation is the problem, he said, not the perception itself. I looked at him more carefully. You were listening earlier. Yes, he said simply. Then we start tomorrow morning, I said, early, before the rest of the unit trains. He nodded with the firm, settled nod of someone who has made a decision and is finished negotiating with themselves about whether it is correct. Sarah Van was at the far end of the pod. I did not look directly at her, but I was aware of her, the way you are aware of a particular presence in any enclosed space. She had been listening to the exchange. I was entirely certain of it. Sarah Van listened to everything and processed everything and discarded nothing that might be useful. When the transport docked with the Dominion's reach and the pod ramp dropped, the unit filed off in order of rank. I came last, as I always did, not because anyone assigned that position to me. It was simply where things had settled, and it was not a position worth contesting. Sarah Van was standing at the edge of the receiving bay. She did not usually wait. She moved through every transition with the same forward momentum, always to the next obligation, always ahead of the present moment. Standing in a receiving bay after an extraction was not something I had ever seen her do. She was standing still. I stopped in front of her. The rest of the unit filed past into the ship's interior, each one quiet. She looked at me. She looked at the blade at my hip. She held out her hand. I understood. I drew the blade slowly and placed it across her palm, handle toward her, edge away, the way you offer a blade to someone you trust to understand what they are holding. She held it. She did not test the edge or swing it or inspect it in any manner that suggested assessment. She simply held it, feeling the weight of it, the balance, the way 412 millimeters of worked carbon steel distributes itself across an open palm. She turned it once so the bay's overhead light moved across the flat of the blade. It was still warm. She held it for a long moment. Your grandfather made this by hand, she said. Yes. On Earth in Yorkshire in a shed. With tools that were older than most of the ships in this fleet, I said. And it has never failed. I considered this carefully. Not once, I said. She turned it one more time. Then she returned it to me handle first with the same deliberate care with which she had received it. I slid it back into the sheath, that low, complete sound. It is a serious instrument, she said. It is, I said. She looked at me. Something had shifted in her expression, not dramatically, not theatrically, with the small, specific precision of a very experienced person updating a central assessment and accepting what the updated assessment means. In my mission record, she said, you will be listed as unit point operative, not as diplomatic attachment. I took a breath. Commander, that designation carries weight among the senior officers. Assigning it to a human on a treaty posting will draw commentary from certain quarters. There is always commentary from certain quarters, she said evenly. They have been producing it for 20 years. My record has been my answer to it. You were the point operative on Keth 9. That is what occurred. I do not submit records that contradict what occurred. Then I am grateful, I said. Do not be grateful, she said, and it was not unkind, only precise. Accuracy is not generosity. It is accuracy. When people look at that record and understand what happened on Keth 9 tonight, they will know it because the record is correct, not because I decided to do you a favor. She paused. The accuracy is the significant thing, Sergeant Morrow, she said. Remember that. She turned and walked toward the command corridor. Her stride was exactly what it always was. Forward, purposeful, the product of long practice. And yet something in it was different. I could not have described the difference in precise terms. It was subtle in the way that significant shifts sometimes are, the particular quality of a person who has updated something important and is still absorbing the full implications of the update. Yethsal appeared at my shoulder. "She has not amended a designation in a mission record in 11 years, he said quietly. The last time she did it, the soldier in question had held a position alone for 4 hours to cover a full unit extraction. I said nothing. "You understand what it means," he said. "Yes," I said. "Good," he looked at the corridor she had walked through. "Tomorrow morning, early." "Early," I said. He left. The bay emptied. I stood alone in the overhead light with the ship moving steadily around me, its engines producing the low, constant vibration that was always present if you paid attention to it, in the floor, in the walls, in the bunk frame at night. I thought about my grandfather. I thought about the shed in Yorkshire and the grinding wheel in the cold mornings and the smell of metal warmed by work. I thought about the morning he pressed the blade into my hands and looked at me with those steady old eyes and told me it never needed charging. I had understood that in the way a young person understands something given to them by someone older, the surface of it, the sentiment, the obvious part. I understood it differently now. He had been giving me something larger than a blade. He had been giving me the distilled logic of 10,000 years of humans learning to do without. Every fire the steel had passed through in the making, every hour of patient grinding, every evening he had cleaned it and assessed it and kept it exactly as it needed to be. All of it was still in the metal, all of it present in the note it made when drawn, all of it available to anyone patient enough to listen for it. That night I sat on my bunk and wrote a letter to my sister Evie. She taught primary school in Bath, and she had written to me every single week since I shipped out without missing one. Her letters were reliable and warm and always contained the same 3 things in some arrangement: news from home, a question about whether I was eating properly, and a small firm reminder that the world she knew was still there and still worth the distance I had put between myself and it. I wrote to her about Keth 9. I told her the shape of it, the parts that were not classified, the essential truth of the night without the specific intelligence details. I wrote, "The galaxy is larger than anything we imagined when we were small. It is full of beings who are stronger than us and faster than us and longer-lived than us. Their weapons are more powerful. Their history is older by hundreds of years. They have resources and capabilities that make what humans have brought to the galaxy look, at first glance, like something from an earlier and simpler time. None of that, as it turns out, is actually the point. The point is that we learned to walk in the dark before we had lights. We learned to navigate before we had instruments. We learned to be completely still before we had sensors that could tell us when to move. We learned to make things with our hands that worked because of craft and attention and care, not because of power. We carried all of that with us when we left Earth. We carry it still. It lives in the way our bodies move and in the things our senses register, and in the habits that 10,000 years of having to be enough built into us long before we ever looked at the stars and decided to go toward them. My grandfather put some of that into a blade and gave it to me and told me it never needed charging. And last night, in a dead moon's tunnels with every instrument offline, and a situation that no briefing had fully anticipated, that particular quality, not needing charging, not requiring power, simply being exactly what it was, turned out to be the only thing that mattered. We are new here, Evie. We are new here and we are small, and there are things in this galaxy that are older and larger than us in almost every way that can be measured. But I am beginning to understand something about what we are underneath all of that. The things we built into ourselves across all those years of difficult and unglamorous human history, they are not small. They are not primitive. They are something that the galaxy is only beginning to understand. They are learning who we are, slowly, encounter by encounter, night by night. I think we are going to be fine. I genuinely, honestly think we are going to be fine. I sealed the letter and sent it and lay down on my bunk and looked at the ceiling. The ship's engines produced their low constant vibration and their low constant note, and I listened to it, the way I had learned to listen to things this night, with attention and patience and the willingness to hear what was actually there rather than what was expected. The note the engines made was complex. There were harmonics in it that came from the interaction of the drive systems with the hull, and those harmonics shifted very slightly as the ship's course changed. And if you knew how to listen, you could track the ship's adjustments in real time without looking at any display. My grandfather would have appreciated that. The blade was on the shelf beside my bunk, in its sheath, at rest. Everything it had done that night was still in it, still in the metal, still in the molecular structure that had been formed by fire and work, and a man's patient hands in a small shed on a planet 420 light-years away. Ready, always ready. Outside, the stars moved past the small port window at the speed of a ship that had a destination and the means to reach it. The dark between stars was not empty. It was full of things that were learning to make room for something new. Tomorrow morning, early, I would begin teaching Yethsal how to navigate without instruments, how to still the body so the senses could work correctly, how to trust the information that arrives without announcement, that lives in the pressure of the air and the quality of sound returning from a surface and the feel of temperature on skin, how to do what humans had always done, be exactly enough when exactly enough was all that was available. It would take time. The best things always take time. But it would take. The blade rested. The ship moved steadily through the dark, and in the way that real changes happen, not with ceremony, not with announcement, but with the quiet and irrefutable weight of something that has simply been proven true. The shape of one small human presence in a very large galaxy had shifted. It would not be the last shift. I was certain of that now. The galaxy was learning. And the blade had sung. And that in the end was the whole story. Not the 40 hollow units and not the locked armor and not the electromagnetic dead zone and not the 12 ribbons on a commander's chest. All of that was the setting. The story was this. A man with a blade made of carbon steel and a grandfather's patience and 10,000 years of human stubbornness walked into the dark and did what the situation required and came back out the other side, and the universe was slightly different for it. We carry what we are. We have always carried it. Across every fire we pass through and every dark we learned to walk in and every instrumentless night we navigated on attention alone. The galaxy is only now beginning to hear it. But it is beginning to hear. And that note once started does not stop easily. It carries.